Mr. B's, Mr. B's, Mr. B's history. Now then, people, the focus of today's video is the German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles. In other words, why were they so angry about a treaty after inflicting colossal damage on the areas that they had occupied, namely Belgium and France? Let's dig into it. So, one of the critical things about history is that it can be written and understood and believed in a variety of different perspectives. And before we go into the depth and meat of this video, what I want us to think about is the difference between the different perceptions of the Allies and Germany. If you look at this little cartoon, it's one of my favourite cartoons. I use it for lots of things, different perspectives about Oliver Cromwell, different views about placing missiles in Cuba in the early 1960s. But I want to think about, if that number on the ground is the Treaty of Versailles, the way the Allies are looking at it, it looks like a 6. And guess what? The way Germany is looking at it, it looks like a 9. So quite often, when we look at the Treaty of Versailles, we look at the Allies' point of view. But the focus of this video, as I've said before, and no doubt we'll say again, is what did the Germans think about this treaty? Why did they hate it quite so much? And they really, really did. So I might say that Germans were really annoyed and really angry by the Treaty of Versailles, but Mr. Bernardes, where's your evidence? Well, here we go. Hold on tight. So one of the signatories of one of the German delegates to the Treaty of Versailles said that the Germans would not have signed if they weren't forced into it and they had seen the ideas earlier. Another German newspaper describes the treaty as a scrap of paper and it's disgraceful. The one I suspect many of your teachers have told you about is Deutsche Zeitung, the German Zeitung, whatever that means. Apologies to German speakers and my embarrassing lack of German. Demand vengeance. Okay? Vengeance for the disgrace of 1919. And there were even large-scale anti-Treaty of Versailles demonstrations in Germany. A photo just appearing on the video here is talking about a day of dishonour. So clearly the German people are very cross. So why were the Germans so cross, I hear you cry? Well, one of the reasons, perhaps unbelievably, is they thought that they were winning in early 1918. But why on earth would the German people think that? Let's find out. So one of the reasons why many German people believed that they were winning World War I in early 1918 was that they had already beaten and defeated one of the Allies, Soviet Union. By the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany had imposed huge punishments, both in terms of territory and money. So Soviet Russia gave up half of its European territory. Some of these countries were going to be controlled by German princelings, and some of them, notably Ukraine, were hoping for their independence, but were going to be under German protection, whatever that means. Probably not a good thing. In summary, Soviet Russia had lost over half of its industrial land, nearly 90% of its coalfields. So it had been an absolutely catastrophic defeat. And in some ways, this gave the peacemakers at Versailles a good reason for punishing Germany. If Germany thought it was okay to punish Russia so harshly, surely that would be okay for the Allies. And there were also the question of reparations. And I really want you to think about this for a moment. Germany imposes reparations on Soviet Russia of only 6 billion gold marks. Versailles sets German reparations at 132 billion gold marks. That's 22 times more. Partly, I think, because Germany didn't lose huge amounts of its industrial power to France. But bear that in mind, we'll come to that later. But back to the main theme. The German people had just defeated Russia. They were winning. 1 down, 2 to go. At the beginning of 1918, it wasn't just the Germans who thought that they might win. Many secretly in the British and French military thought that Germany could well win in 1918. So there's this brilliant quote from Colonel Hugh Drum, just doing the maths, that the British and French numbered about 147 divisions, whereas he believed that Germany could bring, after defeating Russia, all the troops from the east to the west and have 230 divisions. So the British and the French were really concerned that they might lose the war in 1918. What they hoped for was that the Americans, who had declared war on Germany in 1917, would shift the balance of manpower in their favour, as it did towards the end of 1918. What I would like to draw your attention to, however, is the book where I got this quote from, The Doughboys, America and the First World War. If there are any history teachers unwise enough to be listening to this video, I would humbly suggest you may be like I was, that focus on the Western Front in the First World War. Britain and France got new technology, had greater resources, and were going to win the war, and then a few Americans turned up and we won. If you read an American perspective on the First World War, as this one by Mr. Mead, you'll see that actually the American impact, both in funding the war, in supplying munitions for the war, and final decisive manpower for the war, really made a significant difference. And it's a good message that always find out as much as you can from as many different perspectives as possible. So the German people probably thought that they were winning because they'd already defeated Russia. But there was a second aspect to 1918 which made them think that they were winning, and this was the Spring Offensive of 1918, Germany's last big push to win the war before all these pesky Americans turned up. Now, in spring of 1918, Germany launched a massive offensive with new tactics. Fast-moving shock stormtroopers, as you can see in this photo, punched holes in trench defences, which were then quickly followed up by other soldiers. This was such an effective tactic that within the space of 16 days, the German army had captured over 40 miles of territory. Or to put it another way, have a look at this map. You can see the massive advances. Now, the German High Command and the German government made much of this heroic success, telling the German people how brilliantly the soldiers were doing. And this was true up to about June, July 1918. And then the Allies' counterattack with the highly effective 100-day offensive, Battle of Amiens, first effective use of troops, etc., etc. However, the German military and the German government kept the reversals that the Germans were experiencing in mid and late 1918 secret from the German people due to censorship. And so, from many German people's point of view, the Germans were winning. Another reason why the German people, and I'm stressing German people, I'm not talking about the military, I'm not talking about the government, the German people were shocked about what they saw as the unfairness, the unreasonableness, the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles was that Germany was in a really bad way at the time of the armistice in 1918. They had suffered greatly from the Allied shipping blockade stopping food and supplies getting into Germany. An example of this is there's various estimates floating around on the internet, but the most academic research that I've looked at suggests that about 763,000 people, civilians, had died in Germany during World War I. There were large numbers of people who had been weakened through malnutrition who had not died. There were widespread disease, and the German people were pushed to the edge of starvation, even if they have survived and got through something you may have heard of called the turnip winter. An example of this is a picture, I think, from about 1917 of desperate German women using small knives to cut the remaining bits of flesh off a fairly well matured and rotting horse carcass in Berlin. So the Germans had suffered. Surely if they'd suffered so greatly, they wouldn't be punished so horribly at Versailles. So you might think that when the armistice came, the blockade would be lifted and relief supplies would go in from charitable organisations to help German civilians, children, infants, avoid further starvation and disease. However, sadly, that was far from the case. The background to this slide is the famous cartoon where a mother is comforting her starving child, saying, once we've paid the Allies millions of pounds, I'll get you some food. And you can see that poor child is very highly malnourished. Well, the blockade continued. The Allies were determined that the blockade would stay in place until Germany signed the treaty. And this made a bad situation even worse. There's a picture here of food riots in Germany where perhaps this butcher shop had some food, and rather than queue patiently and pay money, there was a riot to try and get hold of it. A slightly more obscure piece of information would be clear evidence of long and sustained malnutrition. So the lower line of these two lines shows how high German children were, German females were, during and after the First World War. You can see that it's much lower than the expected height. It's just a sign of long-term undernourishment. And even as late as 1922, charities were still in Germany. And when I came across this, I must be frank with you, I couldn't believe it. But as late as 1922, an American Quaker charity was still feeding over 1 million German children per day because of the still scarce food supplies in Germany. So not only had the German civilian population suffered during the war, this suffering continued between the armistice, the ceasefire, and the signing of the treaty, which many Germans thought was unfair, unharsh, and uncivilized, and the after effects of that rippled through Germany beyond 1919. So, as I said earlier, the German civilian population in 1918 were under the impression that they were winning. The German army, particularly after the Allied 100-day offensive and the Black Day at Amiens, knew that they were bound to lose. That was going to become ever increasingly certain as more and more Americans arrived. And so what they decided to do quietly in October 1918 was to ask the Allies for a ceasefire, an armistice. They did not ask the British for an armistice. They did not ask the French for an armistice. They asked the Americans. And that's because in 1918, Woodrow Wilson had put forward his famous 14 points, principles for a peace treaty. And the German High Command and German government thought that this offered a route to a fair and reasonable peace. And so as early as October 1918, the Germans are asking for peace. Perhaps not quite as secretly as they hoped. As you can see from the newspaper, they said, right, we want peace, but we want it on the 14 points. The shock coming was the peace they got was not based on the 14 points. But we know a little bit about that, don't we, folks? So then, people, I hope you know that the armistice was agreed to come into force at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918. However, although it was a great joy to many soldiers and civilians, there were even some Allied generals who thought it was a bit of a mistake. The most bullish of the American Commander-in-Chief, General Pershing, essentially said Germany would not know that it was beaten if the armistice was signed. Germany needed to be forced into unconditional surrender, and Allied soldiers should be seen to invade Germany, so the Germans knew that they were defeated. If they didn't do this, then the Germans would not know they were defeated. They would think that the treaty would be unfair, and that they wanted revenge. Who knew that American generals were quite so perceptive? Sounds rude about American generals. It's not meant to. Apologies. So, General Pershing was not the only person who believed that Germany might feel that they hadn't lost the war. Many German people felt that. And how do we know? Well, after the armistice, a group of American military personnel were sent covertly into Germany to try and gather information as to how the German soldiers were retreating, how they were being treated. And the report that they sent back to the American government was so shocking that for many years they kept it secret. And this is just a little preface. I don't always like to read stuff to you because you can read for yourself, I know. But I think it's really important. The discipline and morale of the soldiers was perfect. The troops seemed happy and full of spirits. A triumphal arch was erected at the entrance to Treves, which is a German town, with the inscription, "Welcome to our unconquered heroes." Unconquered heroes. So the armistice is a ceasefire. Clearly, the Germans in this area didn't think that they had lost. And that's not just the only example I've found. This photo is a photo of German soldiers on parade in Berlin after the war. They've got flowers in their hair. So Germany stops fighting. The armistice is a ceasefire. It is not a defeat in the eyes of many German people. That doesn't bode well for the shock of the Treaty of Versailles. So we've seen earlier that the Germans, certainly the German civilian population, didn't fully appreciate the desperate situation of the German military on the Western Front in mid to late 1918. They understood that an armistice, a ceasefire, had been requested, but they expected it to be on Wilson's 14 points. So let's look at what they got. Open diplomacy without secret treaties is one of those things Wilson promised. Oh, Versailles was dictated to the Germans, so straight away that's going against the 14 points. The 14 points said, we are going to decrease the armaments of all nations. Only the losers were forced to disarm, and in fact in the 1930s that's one of the reasons why Hitler left the League of Nations, because he berated the Allies, probably rightly, that they had not disarmed at all and had gone against the provisions both of the 14 points and the promises that they made in the Covenant of the League of Nations. They're going to adjust colonial claims. Well, that's a vague term. You can say anything in such a vague thing, but Germany lost all of her colonies. Remember, Germany's rise to a great world power, one of the key components of that under Kaiser Wilhelm was to get a place in the sun, and that had been lost. So again, Germans would have felt that they were being treated like a second or third class country. Belgium was going to be evacuated and restored. Alsace-Lorraine was going back to France, and there was going to be the creation of an independent Polish state with access to the sea. Well, all those things happened. But those weren't the worst bits. There were some things there that the German people didn't like, but it's going to get worse. Okay, so we've looked at the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles and how some of them were linked or slightly different to the things that the Germans were expecting. But the Treaty of Versailles surprises the Germans in three horrible ways, what I call the three no's. There was no mention of war guilt in the 14 points, but it's there blaming Germany for starting the war. There is no mention in Wilson's 14 points of reparations. Now, I suspect the Germans expected to have to pay for some of the costs of the war. In fact, they were prepared as part of their negotiating strategy, if they were allowed to offer reparations. But I think the thing that surprised them was the size and scale of the reparations, particularly considering all the suffering that the German civilian population had undergone during and after the First World War. The 132 billion gold marks that the Germans were made to pay, theoretically, was 22 times what they'd imposed on Soviet Russia. And you can see quite clearly that would have been a horrendous surprise and shock. And finally, beyond those things mentioned specifically in the 14 points, Alsace-Lorraine, Poland getting access to the sea. They lose even more territory, Eupen, Malmedy, North Schleswig, and the Rhineland is demilitarized. So were they shocked by it? You betcha. So another German delegate to the Treaty of Versailles describes it as victorious violence. It's more than the German people can bear. That's why they were so cross and angry at the Treaty of Versailles. And friends, the end is near. Promise I won't sing too much more. So, as I get to the end of the video, if you want to think about how we can summarise it, I'd just like to think about a female pig. Obviously, what's not to think? Why were the German people so angry at the Treaty of Versailles? Well, they had suffered horrendously during the war years and after the armistice and beyond the signing of the treaty as a result of the Allied blockade. When the armistice came into force, German armed forces were still occupying large parts of France and much of Belgium. Many of the German people thought that they were winning. They'd just defeated Soviet Russia and they were still, as I said earlier, in France. And they were shocked that the peace that they'd asked for based on Wilson's 14 points was not delivered. So why is the German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles like a female pig? Well, it sows people, obviously. Well, that's the end of another video from myself. It's been a really detailed video. It's been a long one. I hope you stuck with it. If you have any comments, positive, negative, any suggestions, then please either leave a comment below or email me. Yes, I know it could be shorter, but I just got carried away and I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you and good night.